The wedding dress had once been pristine white silk, imported from St. Louis at considerable expense, adorned with pearls that caught the dying light, like tears frozen in time. Now it hung in bloody tatters from Sarah McKenna's trembling shoulders as she collapsed into the arms of the man she'd loved since childhood, but could never claim. Standing Bear caught her against his bronze chest, his calloused hands gentle as morning dew as they cradled her dirt-streaked face. The sacred waters of the Powder River sang their ancient song behind them. But all Sarah could hear was the thunder of her own heartbeat and the approaching hoofbeats of death itself. "Sarah," he whispered, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer in the Cheyenne tongue he'd taught her in stolen moments behind the fort's supply wagons. "I will never let you go." Blood bloomed across the silk like crimson flowers as she pressed herself against him, feeling the familiar strength of the warrior who had once carved her initials into cottonwood bark with a bone knife. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was finally in his arms, and it might be the last thing either of them ever knew. The hoofbeats grew louder. 50 yards and closing. The sound of sabers rattling against saddles of rifles being primed for killing of men who'd been paid to ensure that love like theirs never saw another sunrise. "They're coming," she gasped, tasting copper and desperation on her lips. Standing Bear's dark eyes reflected the dying light of the Wyoming sun as he lifted her chin with one finger, the gesture achingly tender despite the violence closing in around them. "Then let them come. Some promises are worth dying for." Behind them, the sacred pool that had witnessed 1,000 seasons of Cheyenne prayers reflected the blood-red sky, its waters holding secrets older than the white man's hunger for gold and land. It was here that Standing Bear had first told her he loved her. It would be here that their story ended, or began anew, in whatever world waited beyond this one. Together. Sarah whispered, her voice breaking like glass against stone. "Together." Standing Bear replied, his warrior's heart steady as bedrock, even as death rode toward them across the sage-scented evening. In this world, and all that follow. Fort Laramie squatted on the North Platte like a wooden fortress thrust against the endless Wyoming sky. Its palisade walls built from timber hauled across 200 miles of prairie and military determination. The morning of Sarah McKenna's wedding dawned clear and cold, October frost painting the parade ground silver while the distant mountains wore crowns of early snow. From her window in the officers' quarters, Sarah watched the Cheyenne delegation preparing to depart after 3 days of increasingly tense negotiations. The talks had been a facade she was beginning to understand. The theater performed for the territorial government, while darker plans took shape in smoke-filled rooms where men traded lives like poker chips. Her wedding dress hung in the corner like a ghost of someone else's future, its elaborate bustle and pearl-button bodice representing everything she'd been taught to want, but had never desired. In 3 hours, she would walk down the aisle of the Post Chapel to marry General William Harrison, a union that would secure her father's promotion and strengthen the territorial government's grip on the frontier. It should have been the happiest day of her life. Instead, it felt like stepping into her own grave, admiring the wildlife darling. Harrison's voice cut through her melancholy like a cavalry saber through silk. He stood behind her, adjusting his dress uniform in the mirror, his reflection all hard angles and cold calculation. At 45, Harrison represented everything the frontier valued: military precision, political ambition, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that built empires on other people's graves. Sarah's fingers unconsciously touched the small medicine pouch hidden beneath her corset turquoise and sweetgrass tokens of a love that existed only in shadow and stolen moments. "Just saying goodbye." "Good riddance," Harrison said, smoothing his mustache with practiced vanity. "The sooner we're rid of these treaty obligations, the better for everyone involved." Through the window, Sarah watched Standing Bear hold his father's war pony, every line of his body, speaking of controlled power and gentle strength. Even at this distance, she could feel the pull of connection that had bound them since childhood. invisible as gravity, twice as dangerous and stronger than any force she'd ever known. Her earliest memory wasn't of her father's booming voice or her nursemaid's gentle lullabies. It was of a 7-year-old Cheyenne boy, with serious dark eyes and patient hands, showing her how to weave grass into dolls while their fathers argued over maps and treaties in the fort's main building. Standing Bear had been brought to Fort Laramie as part of a fragile peace agreement, a living symbol of his father's good intentions. While the adults negotiated over boundaries and hunting rights, 2 children had discovered that friendship needed no translation. He taught her to track deer by their hoofprints and read weather in the flight patterns of birds. She taught him English letters and how to make her father laugh with silly jokes about Army life. They were 2 souls who saw past skin color to the truth beneath, and what they found there was the seed of something beautiful and forbidden. The railroad survey came in yesterday. Harrison continued his tone conversational as he examined his reflection. This valley could support 50,000 settlers within 10 years, more than enough to justify federal investment in infrastructure. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. What about the Cheyenne hunting grounds? Harrison's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Hunting grounds, my dear girl, this is 1871, not the Stone Age. Progress demands efficiency, and the savages have had their turn at this land. They've honored every treaty, Sarah said carefully, knowing that contradicting Harrison too openly would only invite his wrath. Treaties are paper, Harrison replied dismissively. Progress is steel and gunpowder, and the will to use both effectively. Your father understands this better than most. The casual cruelty in his voice made Sarah's skin crawl. She'd grown up hearing such talk from Army officers, but it had never felt personal before, never cut directly into her heart like a blade finding its mark between ribs. They're human beings, William. They have families, children who laugh and cry, just like they have what we allow them to have. Harrison interrupted, turning from the mirror to face her directly. His pale blue eyes held the kind of cold calculation that Sarah had learned to fear. Your father understands the larger picture. The territorial government, the railroad companies, the federal investment in frontier development, all of it depends on maintaining order and eliminating obstacles to progress. There was threat in his tone, velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Sarah nodded mutely, hating herself for the capitulation, but knowing that open defiance would only make things worse for everyone she cared about. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Harrison barked permission to enter, and Lieutenant Morrison stepped inside, his young face flushed with excitement and something that might have been fear. General, sir. Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled. Colonel McKenna requests your immediate presence in his office. Something about the morning patrol. Harrison frowned, his attention sharpening like a hawk spotting prey. What about the morning patrol? Morrison glanced at Sarah, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, like candlelight in wind. Perhaps it would be better discussed privately, sir. Speak freely, Lieutenant. Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Miss McKenna will be my wife in 3 hours. She might as well begin adjusting to military realities. Morrison's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with speaking in front of Sarah. Sir, the patrol found evidence of weapons smuggling. A cache hidden in Devil's Canyon, 30 Winchester rifles, and several cases of ammunition. The tracks suggest... He paused, his eyes darting between Harrison and Sarah like a nervous animal seeking escape. The tracks suggest what Lieutenant Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a battlefield roar. The tracks suggest someone familiar with our patrol routes placed them there recently, sir. Someone who knew exactly where our men would find them. The silence that followed was thick as winter fog, heavy with implications that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Harrison's face remained perfectly composed, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible pause before he responded. Indians stealing army weapons. Harrison said finally, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. Hardly surprising given their desperation. Actually, sir. Morrison continued, his voice growing smaller with each word. These aren't Army issue. They're Winchester repeaters civilian manufacture. The kind that what Lieutenant Harrison's interruption was soft as silk and sharp as steel. That sell for top dollar to hostile tribes, sir. The kind someone might use to arm enemies of local peace. Sarah felt pieces clicking together in her mind, like bullets sliding into chambers. Weapons smuggling. Someone with inside knowledge of patrol routes. Civilian rifles being sold to hostile tribes. Harrison's casual certainty about solving the Indian problem permanently. The convenient timing of this discovery on her wedding day, just as the Cheyenne delegation was departing. She looked at Harrison's reflection in the mirror and saw calculation behind his pale eyes, the cold arithmetic of a man measuring risks and benefits, like a banker counting coins. Thank you, Lieutenant, Harrison said smoothly, his composure never wavering. Please inform the Colonel I'll be along shortly to discuss this development. Morrison saluted with visible relief and fled, clearly grateful to escape the sudden tension in the room. Harrison watched him go, then turned to Sarah with a smile that never reached his eyes. Their wedding nerves, he said lightly, as if discussing the weather. Everyone sees conspiracies in every shadow when emotions run high. I should attend to this nonsense before our ceremony. He kissed her cheek, the gesture possessive rather than affectionate, his lips cold against her skin. Try not to let idle gossip trouble you, my dear. Military life is full of rumors and speculation. Harrison strode from the room, leaving Sarah alone with her growing understanding of the trap that was closing around everyone she cared about. She moved to the window that overlooked the parade ground, where the Cheyenne delegation was making final preparations for their journey home. Chief White Eagle sat his horse with the dignity of a man who'd negotiated 20 treaties and watched 19 of them be broken by white greed and governmental convenience. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who'd seen too much betrayal to be surprised by more, yet still hoped for peace between their peoples. Beside him, Standing Bear controlled his restless pony with unconscious grace, his dark eyes scanning the fort's walls as if memorizing every detail. At 24, he'd grown into everything Sarah had dreamed he might become: a warrior. With the strength to fight and the wisdom to seek peace, a leader who commanded respect through character rather than fear. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah felt her heart stop. Even 50 yards away, she could see the pain in his expression, the knowledge that today marked the end of everything they'd never been allowed to have. She pressed her palm against the window glass, and after a moment that stretched like eternity standing, Bear raised his hand in response. It was the smallest of gestures, invisible to anyone not looking for it, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's forbidden love. The delegation began moving toward the main gate, horses and riders, flowing like water finding its natural course. Sarah watched until the last man disappeared into the prairie's vastness, taking her heart with him into the wilderness. Miss Sarah. She turned to find Private Carson standing in the doorway, his freckled face troubled. At 18, Billy Carson was one of the youngest soldiers at the fort, barely old enough to shave, but already weathered by frontier life. He'd always been kind to Sarah, treating her with the gentle respect of a younger brother rather than the calculating interest of most men. Your father wants to see you, Carson said quietly. In his office. Says it's urgent. Sarah's blood chilled. After Harrison's revelation about the weapons cache and Morrison's obvious discomfort, urgent could mean anything. Did he say why? Carson shook his head, but his eyes were worried. Just that you should come quick, miss. And that... He hesitated, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. That you might want to hear this before your wedding. The words carried ominous weight. Sarah nodded and followed Carson across the parade ground, her elaborate morning dress rustling like dead leaves in autumn wind. The fort bustled with its usual activity, soldiers drilling supply wagons, arriving, the endless routine of military life on the frontier. But something felt wrong. Conversation stopped when she passed. Men avoided her eyes or watched her with expressions she couldn't read. The kind of unnatural quiet that settled over places where dangerous secrets lived and breathed. Colonel McKenna's office occupied a corner of the headquarters building, its windows offering commanding views of both the parade ground and the vast Wyoming territory beyond. Sarah found her father standing with his back to the door, his weathered hands clasped behind him, as he stared out at the emptiness that stretched to the horizon. At 58, James McKenna carried himself like a man who'd seen too much and done worse in service to his country and his conscience. His graying hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform immaculate, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid posture of someone carrying an unbearable weight. "But you wanted to see me?" McKenna turned slowly, and Sarah was shocked by what she saw. Her father looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his face pale as old parchment, his eyes haunted by something that might have been grief or guilt or the terrible combination of both. "Sit down, Sarah." The formality in his voice frightened her more than shouting would have. "I'd rather stand." McKenna nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that response. "There's something you need to know. About your mother. About who you really are." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, staggering her backward. Her father rarely spoke of his wife, who died of fever when Sarah was 3. She had only fragments of memory, gentle hands that smelled of sage and roses. A soft voice singing lullabies in a language she hadn't understood, the warmth of being held and loved without condition. "What about her?" McKenna was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window that only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of buried guilt and 19 years of carefully constructed lies. "Her name was Morning Light. She was 19 when I met her, beautiful as sunrise over the mountains. She was also the daughter of a Cheyenne medicine man captured during a raid on a settlement near Fort Collins." The room seemed to tilt around Sarah, the familiar walls and furniture suddenly foreign and threatening. "Cheyenne. I was supposed to send her to the reservation with the other captives." McKenna continued, as if he hadn't heard her shocked whisper. "Standard procedure for prisoners of war. But she was..." His voice broke slightly. "She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. And when she looked at me, I saw something I'd never seen before in any woman's eyes. Hope. Trust. The possibility of love that could bridge any divide." Sarah sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady as water. Half Cheyenne. Her mother had been Cheyenne, which meant that she... "I'm half-blood." She whispered, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water. McKenna's nod was barely perceptible, a movement heavy with years of hidden truth. "I've spent 19 years hiding that fact, protecting you from a world that would destroy you for something you can't control. Do you understand what would happen if certain people learned the truth, what it would mean for both of us?" Sarah's mind reeled as pieces of her life rearranged themselves into new and terrifying patterns. Her father's protectiveness that had sometimes bordered on paranoia, his insistence on controlling her social interactions, choosing her friends, vetting every potential suitor, his determination to marry her to Harrison despite her obvious reluctance. "You're using me," she said, the realization hitting like a cavalry charge. "This wedding, Harrison's promotion, your political connections, you're trading me to secure your own position." "I'm protecting us both," McKenna said sharply, his military bearing reasserting itself. "Harrison is politically connected, ambitious, destined for high command. As his wife, you'll be untouchable. Your mixed blood will become irrelevant, a footnote in your husband's illustrious career." "What about love?" Sarah demanded, thinking of Standing Bear's gentle hands and warrior's heart. What about happiness? What about the right to choose my own future? McKenna's laugh was bitter as old coffee, harsh with years of compromise and moral accommodation. Love is what killed your mother, Sarah. Love is what gets people like us destroyed by forces we can't control. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, some last vestige of filial duty cracking under the weight of truth. How did she die, Perilli? McKenna's face went pale as old bones, his eyes darting away from hers like a guilty child caught in a lie. Fever. You know that. Quick and merciless the way frontier illnesses often are. Do I? Sarah stood moving to the window, where she'd watched Standing Bear disappear into the prairie. Or is that just another lie you've told to protect your precious career? Before McKenna could answer, a commotion erupted from the parade ground below, shouting voices, running feet, the sharp crack of orders being barked with military precision. Sarah peered through the glass and saw soldiers forming up in mounted formation, weapons loaded and ready for immediate action. What's happening? McKenna joined her at the window, his face grim as winter stone. Trouble. More than just the weapons cache, Morrison reported. Through the glass, Sarah could see General Harrison in the center of the chaos, sitting his black stallion like a conqueror surveying a battlefield. His uniform was spotless, despite the morning's urgency, his bearing that of a man completely in control of events, unfolding according to his design. The morning patrol found more than hidden rifles. McKenna said quietly. They found bodies. Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Bodies? 3 Cheyenne warriors, including 2 horses Chief White Eagle's nephew. Tortured and scalped, left where our men would find them. McKenna's voice was professionally neutral, but Sarah caught the tremor beneath his control. Harrison's organizing a pursuit force. Claims the delegation was attacked by hostiles on their way home. The lie was so transparent, so obviously constructed for political convenience, that Sarah felt physically sick. They weren't attacked by hostiles. They were murdered. By white men. McKenna turned to face her, his eyes desperate and pleading. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Whatever you think you know, whatever you suspect, forget it. Bury it deeper than your mother's grave. Some truths are too dangerous to speak, especially for people like us. But Sarah was beyond listening to her father's warnings. She was thinking of Standing Bear, riding into an ambush of Chief White Eagle's delegation, being butchered by men who wore masks to hide their identities, but couldn't hide their greed. She was thinking of the weapons cache discovered so conveniently of Harrison's cold calculation when discussing the Indian problem. Where's the delegation? She asked, her voice steady despite the terror growing in her chest. Sarah, where are they, Pa? McKenna's shoulders sagged in defeat, the bearing of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. Devil's Canyon. Same place the weapons were found. Harrison says it's evidence they were involved in the smuggling operation. Sarah's world tilted on its axis as the full scope of the trap became clear. Devil's Canyon was a natural killing ground, high walls on all sides, narrow approaches that could be easily blocked, water source that would draw both men and animals. If the delegation had been lured there under false pretenses, I have to warn them, she said, moving toward her riding clothes, hanging in the corner wardrobe. McKenna caught her arm, his grip iron hard despite his age. You'll do no such thing. You'll put on that wedding dress and marry Harrison, and you'll do it with a smile. Because if you don't, we'll both be dead before the sun sets. Sarah stared into her father's eyes and saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Not the professional wariness of a career soldier, but the bone-deep terror of a man who'd made a deal with devils and found himself drowning in the consequences. What have you done? She whispered. Before he could answer, boots thundered on the stairs outside. The door burst open without ceremony, and General Harrison strode in his uniform, perfect despite the morning's chaos, his pale eyes taking in Sarah's riding clothes and her father's guilty expression. "Colonel, we need to discuss our operational parameters," Harrison said briskly, then stopped as his cold gaze fixed on Sarah. "Going somewhere, my dear. Just changing clothes," Sarah said carefully, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The wedding dress is rather warm for a morning like this." Harrison's smile was sharp as a scalping knife. "How thoughtful of you to consider comfort over appearance. But I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. The ceremony will have to be postponed." Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully she nearly staggered, though she fought to keep her expression neutral. "Postponed? The Indian situation requires immediate attention." Harrison continued, his voice carrying deadly calm. "We can't have hostile tribes threatening the peace on our wedding day. Bad for morale, you understand." McKenna stepped forward, confusion written across his weathered features. "William, surely the ceremony can proceed as planned. The men need some good news after this morning's discoveries. The men need decisive action." Harrison corrected his tone, brooking no argument. "They need to see their commanders taking charge of a deteriorating situation. Which is why I'm leading a strike force into hostile territory to eliminate this threat once and for all." Sarah felt ice water flooding her veins as the true scope of Harrison's plan became clear. Eliminate what threat? Harrison's eyes fixed on hers, and she saw calculation behind his gaze, the look of a chess master moving pieces toward inevitable checkmate. The weapons smuggling operation, of course. Chief White Eagle's people have been arming hostile tribes for months, creating instability throughout the territory. Today's attack on our patrol proves they can't be trusted to honor their treaties. The lie was masterfully constructed, Sarah realized, with growing horror. The planted weapons, the murdered warriors, the convenient timing, all of it designed to justify what Harrison had probably planned from the very beginning. "You're going to attack the Cheyenne village." She said the words falling from her lips like accusations. "I'm going to restore order to a lawless territory," Harrison replied smoothly. "Protect American interests. Ensure the peace that allows civilization to flourish in this wilderness. And if there are casualties among non-combatants," Harrison shrugged, the gesture casual as discussing the weather. "War has consequences, my dear. The sooner the savages learn that lesson, the better for everyone involved." Sarah thought of Standing Bear's gentle hands, teaching her to braid sweetgrass of Chief White Eagle's dignity during countless treaty negotiations of children playing in the Cheyenne camp she'd visited during more peaceful times. "How many soldiers?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "2 full companies," Harrison replied with satisfaction. 120 men armed with rifles and cavalry sabers, enough to handle any resistance we might encounter. 120 armed men mounted on fast horses riding to massacre a peace camp whose warriors were scattered across the territory on hunting expeditions. It wouldn't be a battle. It would be wholesale slaughter. "I won't let you do this." Sarah said the words escaping before she could stop them. The room fell silent, except for the tick of McKenna's pocket watch and the distant sounds of military preparation from the parade ground. Harrison and her father exchanged a look, heavy with meaning and shared secrets. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice in this matter," Harrison said finally, his voice soft as silk and deadly as poison. "You see, my dear, your cooperation in this enterprise isn't optional. There are certain considerations that make your compliance absolutely essential to our mutual well-being." "What considerations?" Harrison moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, as he gazed out at the soldiers forming up for what they believed was a legitimate military operation. "Your father hasn't told you about our business arrangement. How disappointing. James, surely your daughter deserves to know the truth about our family enterprise." Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized she was about to learn something that would change everything forever. "What business arrangement?" "Import and export," Harrison said lightly, as if discussing commodity trading. We import peace treaties and export armed conflicts. It's been surprisingly profitable for all parties involved. The truth hit Sarah like a cavalry charge to the chest. You've been selling weapons to hostile tribes. We've been creating market demand for military intervention. Harrison corrected with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow student. A Comanche raid here, a Blackfoot attack there, nothing too dramatic, just enough to justify increased federal spending on frontier defense. And the Cheyenne were becoming inconveniently peaceful, Harrison admitted with a slight frown. Chief White Eagle's influence was spreading, convincing other tribes to honor their treaties and seek accommodation with white settlers. Terrible for business, you understand. Sarah felt her world collapse around her like a house built on sand. Her father, her own father, was an arms dealer who profited from Indian wars. Her intended husband was a war criminal who manufactured conflicts for personal gain. And she was apparently the prize in their sick game. You're monsters. She whispered the words torn from somewhere deep in her soul. We're entrepreneurs operating in a difficult market, Harrison replied calmly. And you, my dear Sarah, are our insurance policy against future complications. How? Harrison's smile was genuinely pleasant, which made it infinitely more terrifying. A McKenna-Harrison marriage sends a clear message about frontier unity to Washington. More importantly, it ensures your father's continued cooperation in our business ventures. McKenna spoke for the first time since Harrison's revelation, his voice hollow as an empty grave. If anything happens to Sarah, certain evidence about our operations might find its way to territorial authorities. William understands this perfectly, just as James understands that certain evidence about his daughter's unique heritage might find its way to the territorial newspapers. Harrison countered smoothly. Half-breed children of Army officers make such interesting reading for the public. Mutual assured destruction, as the diplomats say. Very civilized. Sarah looked between the two men who had shaped her life, seeing them clearly for the first time. Her father, the war hero, who'd built his reputation on manufactured conflicts and other people's blood. Her intended the general who dressed murder up as military necessity and called it progress. Both of them trapped in a web of mutual blackmail and shared guilt that had somehow snared her as well. What about love? She asked, thinking of Standing Bear's warrior's wisdom and gentle heart. What about honor? What about doing what's right instead of what's profitable? Harrison's laugh was genuinely amused, the sound of a man who found her naivety charming. Love honor. My dear girl, this is 1871, not some romantic novel written by Eastern idealists. The frontier is built on practical men making practical choices. Everything else is sentiment that gets people killed. Outside, a bugle sounded assembly with sharp martial notes that cut through the morning air. The strike force was forming up 120 armed men preparing to ride toward genocide, while believing they were serving justice. Sarah watched through the window as soldiers checked their weapons and adjusted their gear, each man a tool in Harrison's machine of calculated destruction. Some were barely older than she was, farm boys from Ohio and Pennsylvania, who joined the Army seeking adventure and steady pay. Others were grizzled veterans who'd fought in the Civil War and knew the weight of taking human life. None of them knew they were about to participate in mass murder disguised as military necessity. The wedding will take place tonight, Harrison announced with the satisfied air of a man whose plans were proceeding perfectly. After we return from our mission, I want the ceremony to coincide with news of our victory over the hostile forces threatening territorial security. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. I won't marry you. I won't be part of this obscenity. Oh, but you will, Harrison said, turning from the window to face her directly. Because if you don't, a lot of innocent people will suffer unnecessarily. Your Cheyenne friends, for instance. My orders authorize the elimination of all hostile elements in the target area. However, those orders could be interpreted more broadly if circumstances require flexibility. The threat was crystal clear. Comply with his demands, or watch everyone she'd ever cared about die for her defiance. "You bastard!" She breathed the epithet torn from her throat like a physical wound. "I prefer pragmatist," Harrison replied with unruffled calm. "James, please ensure your daughter remains in her quarters until our return. It would be most unfortunate if she developed any romantic notions about warning our enemies of our legitimate military operations." McKenna nodded miserably, a broken man watching his sins come home to roost like vultures circling carrion. "Sarah, please, don't make this any harder than it has to be." But Sarah was beyond listening to her father's pleas for compliance. She was thinking of standing bare somewhere in the wilderness, unaware that death was riding toward him with military precision and government authorization. She was thinking of children who would die because two white men had decided their lives were acceptable casualties in a larger game of power and profit. "I need air," she said suddenly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I can't breathe in here with all this planning." Harrison studied her face carefully, looking for signs of deception or incipient rebellion. After a moment, he nodded slightly. "Very well, but you'll be escorted at all times. Private Morrison, please accompany Miss McKenna to the parade ground. Ensure she doesn't wander off in her emotional state." Young Morrison appeared in the doorway as if summoned by magic, his freckled face troubled but professionally neutral. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes, duty warring with decency, military orders competing with human conscience. "Come along, miss," he said quietly, his voice carrying subtle sympathy. "Perhaps some fresh air will help clear your head." Sarah nodded and moved toward the door, and then paused beside Harrison with what she hoped looked like resigned acceptance. "General, may I ask you something?" "Of course, my dear. Do you ever have nightmares about the people you've killed or ordered killed?" Harrison's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind his pale eyes. "I sleep very well, thank you. The sleep of the righteous, as they say in the good book." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, committing his words to memory. "I hope you remember saying that when the time comes." She walked out before he could respond, Morrison trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. The parade ground buzzed with military activity, horses being saddled, weapons loaded, rations distributed, maps consulted. Two companies of the best soldiers on the frontier preparing to earn their pay with Cheyenne blood, while believing they were serving justice and protecting innocent settlers. "Miss Sarah," Morrison said quietly as they descended the headquarters steps, "perhaps we should return to your quarters. This isn't really appropriate for a lady to witness." Instead of responding, Sarah spun to face him with desperate intensity. "Billy, how long have you known me?" Morrison blinked at the unexpected question, clearly confused by the change of subject. "Since I was assigned here 2 years ago, miss." "Why do you ask? Have I ever lied to you, ever asked you to do anything dishonorable or against your conscience?" "No, miss," Morrison replied slowly, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "You've always been kind to me. More than kind, actually. Like having a sister who cared about my welfare." Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that wouldn't carry to the nearby soldiers preparing for their mission. "Then listen to me very carefully, Billy, and believe every word I'm about to tell you. General Harrison is planning to massacre a peaceful Cheyenne village. Women and children are going to die because of lies he's told about weapons smuggling and hostile attacks." Morrison's young face went pale as fresh snow. "Miss Sarah, that's a very serious accusation to make against a general officer." "It's the truth," Sarah interrupted with fierce conviction. "My father and Harrison have been selling weapons to hostile tribes for years, creating conflicts to justify military intervention and federal spending on frontier defense. Today's attack is designed to eliminate witnesses to their crimes and provide cover for even larger operations, even if that were true. Morrison said carefully, his voice dropping to match her whisper. What could we possibly do about it? I'm just a private and you're... I'm someone who can get to the stable without being stopped or questioned. Sarah finished. Someone who knows the trails to Devil's Canyon better than any man in this fort. Someone who might be able to warn Chief White Eagle before it's too late to save innocent lives. Morrison stared at her, understanding dawning in his eyes like sunrise over the mountains. You want me to help you escape from the fort? I want you to help me save innocent people from being murdered. Miss Sarah, if they catch us, if Harrison discovers what we've done. They won't catch us if we're smart about it and move quickly. Sarah gripped his arm, feeling the tremor of fear beneath his wool uniform. Billy, I know what I'm asking. I know the risk to both of us. But can you live with yourself if you do nothing while women and children are slaughtered? Morrison looked around the parade ground at soldiers preparing for what they believed was a legitimate military operation against hostile Indians. Most of them were good men, following orders unaware they were being used as instruments of genocide for private profit. The stable's guarded, he said finally, his voice barely audible. By who? Sergeant Kowalski and Private Peters. Sarah thought quickly, her mind racing through possibilities. Kowalski was a 20-year veteran who followed orders without question and never deviated from regulations. Peters was newer, younger, more likely to be distracted by a plausible story. Can you get them away from the stable doors? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his conscience warring with military discipline and the fear of court-martial. Finally, he nodded slowly. There's a supply wagon that arrived this morning. I could suggest they help unload it, tell them the quartermaster needs extra hands. How long would that give us? 10 minutes, maybe 15 if I can make the work seem urgent enough. Sarah felt hope flicker in her chest like a candle flame in wind. That's enough time to saddle Luna and get clear of the fort perimeter. And then what? Even if you reach Devil's Canyon, what makes you think the Cheyenne will believe you? You're a white woman, daughter of an army colonel? Because someone there knows I would never lie about something this important. Sarah interrupted, touching the medicine pouch beneath her dress. Someone who's known me since childhood and understands that love transcends the hatred between our peoples. Morrison studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod with growing conviction. Give me 5 minutes to get to the stable and engage the guards. Then come around the back way through the sutler's shop and the blacksmith's forge. Billy, Miss Sarah, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No more talking, no more hesitation. Just quick, decisive action. Morrison's young face had hardened with resolve. 5 minutes. Not a second more. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this boy barely 19 and far from home who was risking everything to help her prevent a massacre. Thank you. She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Now thank me when we're both still alive tomorrow. Morrison replied grimly. Now go back inside and act normal until I signal you. Sarah climbed the steps to the officers' quarters, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She could hear Harrison and her father talking in low voices behind the closed door, probably finalizing their plans for the evening's wedding ceremony and the territorial politics that would follow. Instead of returning to them, she slipped into the small room she used for sewing, where her riding clothes hung in a pine wardrobe alongside her more formal dresses. She changed quickly, abandoning the elaborate morning dress for practical wool and leather that would serve her better in the wilderness. From her window, she could see Morrison approaching the stable with casual purposefulness, his manner suggesting routine business rather than conspiracy. True to his word, he engaged Kowalski and Peters in animated conversation, gesturing toward the supply wagon with the urgency of someone conveying important orders. Sarah waited until both guards moved away from the stable doors, then slipped out through the back of the building. The sutler's shop provided excellent cover as she made her way across the compound, staying in shadows and using buildings to screen her movement from the main parade ground, where soldiers continued their preparations. The stable smelled of hay and horse's leather, and the warm musk of animals' familiar scents that reminded her of countless stolen afternoons, riding with Standing Bear through the Wyoming countryside. Luna, her bay mare, nickered softly as Sarah approached her stall, the horse sensing her rider's urgency and responding with nervous energy. "Easy, girl," Sarah whispered, working quickly to saddle the mare with practiced efficiency. "We're going for a ride. A very important ride that might save a lot of lives." She led Luna toward the back entrance of the stable, where a small gate opened onto the service road that connected to the main trail system. Morrison appeared just as she reached the exit, his face tight with controlled fear, but his bearing still professional. "They're starting to ask questions about your whereabouts," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. "How much time do you need to reach Devil's Canyon?" 2 hours if I push hard and stick to the direct route. Maybe 3 if I have to detour around patrol routes or other complications." Morrison nodded and pressed something into her hand, a small pistol and a leather pouch containing ammunition. "It's not much against a full company of cavalry, but it's something." Sarah tucked the weapon into her saddlebag, her throat tight with emotion at this young soldier's courage. "Billy, when they discover I'm gone, I'll handle it," he said firmly, his voice carrying more authority than his 19 years should have possessed. "I'll tell them you seemed upset about the postponed wedding and asked to walk alone to clear your head. That should buy you at least an hour before they start a serious search." Sarah swung into the saddle, her riding skirts billowing around her legs, as Luna pranced beneath her, eager to run. The mare was fresh and strong, capable of covering the distance to Devil's Canyon in good time if they encountered no obstacles. "I'm Billy whatever happens next," Sarah said, looking down at the young soldier who'd chosen conscience over career. "You're a good man. Better than most officers I've known." "So are you, Miss Sarah," he replied with a slight smile that transformed his serious face. "Now ride hard and don't look back. Save some lives for both of us." Sarah spurred Luna through the gate and into the Wyoming wilderness, riding toward Devil's Canyon and whatever awaited her there. Behind her, Fort Laramie continued its preparation for war, unaware that one woman, in a torn riding dress, was racing to prevent a massacre that would stain the territory's history with innocent blood. The morning sun climbed higher as she rode, painting the prairie in shades of gold and green that spoke of autumn's approach. Sarah knew these trails like a book, written in her heart, every creek bed and ridgeline, every grove of cottonwoods, and stretch of open ground where a rider could make good time or find concealment. Standing Bear had taught her to read the land during stolen afternoons when duty and propriety had been forgotten in favor of love and learning. He'd shown her how to move unseen through country that seemed empty to white eyes, but was actually filled with signs and stories for those who knew how to read them. Now she used that knowledge in a desperate race against time, following deer paths and dry washes that would leave minimal tracks for military pursuers to follow. Luna responded to her urgency, the mare stretching into a ground-eating gallop that devoured the miles between the fort and Devil's Canyon. As she rode, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was already too late, that Harrison's carefully laid plans were unfolding exactly as he'd intended, with clockwork precision that accounted for every variable, except her desperate intervention. Still, she rode on, carrying love and warning into the teeth of approaching darkness, praying to whatever gods watched over star-crossed lovers that she would find Standing Bear alive at the end of her journey. Devil's Canyon cut into the Wyoming landscape like a wound that refused to heal, its red sandstone walls rising 200 feet above a creek that had carved this passage over countless millennia. The canyon stretched for nearly 3 miles, twisting and turning through geological formations that created dozens of hidden alcoves and side passages where secrets could be buried or ambushes prepared. Sarah approached from the east, following game trails that Standing Bear had shown her during happier times when the future had seemed full of possibility rather than dread. She dismounted a quarter-mile from the canyon mouth and tied Luna to a stunted pine, knowing that the rest of her journey would have to be made on foot. The silence was wrong. She could feel it before she could name it, the unnatural quiet that settled over places where violence had recently occurred. No bird songs echoed from the canyon walls. No rustle of small animals in the brush. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath in horror at what it had witnessed. Sarah drew Morrison's pistol and checked its load, then began moving toward the canyon entrance with every skill Standing Bear had taught her about moving unseen through hostile territory. Each step was carefully placed, each shadow evaluated for concealment, each sound analyzed for threat or opportunity. The first body lay just inside the canyon entrance. 2 horses, Chief White Eagle's nephew, sprawled face down in the sandy soil beside the creek. Sarah had known him since childhood, a gentle man who carved wooden toys for the fort's children, and always had a patient smile for anyone who needed encouragement. Now he lay butchered like an animal, his scalp missing his body, bearing the unmistakable marks of prolonged torture. Sarah forced herself to look away and continue deeper into the canyon, her pistol ready, but her heart breaking with each step. More bodies appeared as she moved forward, warriors who had tried to fight elders, who had tried to run horses that had been shot down for no reason except cruelty and the desire to prevent escape. But no women. No children, no Chief White Eagle. Sarah felt a flicker of hope pierce her growing despair. If the main delegation had escaped, if they'd somehow realized the trap in time and managed to reach safety. A groan echoed off the canyon walls, weak but unmistakably human. Sarah froze, every sense straining to locate the source of the sound. It came again, pain-filled, desperate, but definitely alive. She followed the sound to a narrow side canyon where centuries of water flow had carved a natural alcove in the stone. Standing Bear lay in the shadows, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored gasps. Blood matted his long black hair, and his shirt was torn and stained with more blood than any man should lose and still live. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and deep gashes on his chest spoke of knife work, performed with deliberate cruelty. But his dark eyes were open, aware, and they fixed on Sarah's face with wonder and desperate relief. "My heart," he whispered in Cheyenne, using the endearment he'd given her years ago. "I knew you would come." Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds as she tried to assess the damage without causing additional pain. "Don't talk. Save your strength. Must warn you." Standing Bear gasped, his voice barely audible, but carrying urgent determination. "Trap. All of it. Carefully planned trap. I know," Sarah said, tearing strips from her riding skirt to make bandages. "Harrison and my father, they've been selling weapons to hostile tribes, creating conflicts for profit." Standing Bear's eyes widened with effort as he struggled to focus on her face. "Worse than that. Much worse. The delegation split up before entering Canyon. White Eagle took women and children to winter camp in Hidden Valley. But soldiers already riding there." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "How do you know?" "You heard them talking," Standing Bear said, grimacing as pain lanced through him. After torture. Harrison wants no witnesses to arms dealing, no survivors who might testify against him. Sarah worked frantically to stop the bleeding from a deep gash in Standing Bear's side, her medical knowledge limited, but her determination fierce. "Where's Hidden Valley?" "North of here, past Three Sisters Peaks. 2 hours hard ride through mountain passes." "But Sarah..." Standing Bear caught her hand, with fingers that trembled from blood loss and exhaustion. "Cannot stop them alone. Too many soldiers, too well armed. I have to try." "No." Standing Bear's grip tightened, despite his weakness, his warrior's will asserting itself even in extremis. "Live. Please, if we both die here, who will tell the truth about what happened? Who will expose Harrison's crimes?" Sarah looked into his eyes and saw love deeper than the ocean, braver than any warrior's heart, and acceptance of a fate he couldn't change. She also saw the truth he wasn't speaking aloud. He was dying, and they both knew it. "Come with me," she said desperately, already knowing the answer but unable to accept it. "I can get you to Hidden Valley. The medicine man can treat your wounds. Cannot ride." Standing Bear interrupted gently, his voice growing fainter with each word. "Can barely breathe. Lung punctured. But you can still save them." Tears she couldn't control ran down Sarah's cheeks as she held his hand against her face, feeling the warmth of his skin and the steady pulse that was growing weaker by the minute. "I won't leave you here alone to die. Not alone." Standing Bear said, his smile gentle as sunrise over the mountains. "Ancestors waiting for me. Mother, grandmother, they called to me from the spirit world." "Don't you dare," Sarah whispered fiercely, her voice breaking with grief and desperation. "Don't you dare give up on me now. We have a future to build together. Remember, children, to raise a life to live free from all this hatred and violence." Standing Bear's free hand touched her face with infinite tenderness, his thumb brushing away her tears. "In next world, perhaps. This one, too broken for love like ours." The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon, distant but growing closer, the unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses moving at a steady trot. "They're coming back," Sarah whispered, recognizing the danger immediately. Standing Bear struggled to sit up, his warrior's instincts overriding his mortal injuries. "Hidden passage." He gasped, pointing toward what looked like solid rock behind a small waterfall. "Behind falling water. Leads to high trail that connects to Hidden Valley." Sarah could barely see the narrow opening he indicated, concealed by shadows and the constant spray from the waterfall. It would be a treacherous climb, especially with Standing Bear's injuries, but it might be their only chance of escape. "Can you make it?" "Must try," he said, using the canyon wall to pull himself upright. Blood seeped through Sarah's makeshift bandages, but determination blazed in his dark eyes like an unquenchable flame. They moved together toward the hidden passage, Standing Bear leaning heavily on Sarah's shoulder, while she supported as much of his weight as possible. The hoofbeats grew louder. She estimated a dozen riders, probably a cleanup crew sent to eliminate any witnesses who might have survived the initial attack. "Sarah McKenna," a voice called out, echoing off the canyon walls with military authority. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and this goes easy for everyone." Sarah recognized the voice immediately. Sergeant Briggs, one of Harrison's most brutal and loyal enforcers. A career soldier who followed orders without question, no matter how morally questionable, and took personal satisfaction in violence when duty provided an excuse. She helped Standing Bear into the narrow passage behind the waterfall, a space barely wide enough for one person that had been carved by centuries of water flow. The walls were slick with moisture, treacherous for climbing, but it was their only escape route. They climbed in darkness, their hands seeking purchase on wet stone, the sound of their pursuers growing fainter below, but never disappearing entirely. The passage was a natural chimney that rose toward a crack of daylight, far above, steep as a ladder, and twice as dangerous. "On horse tracks," another voice shouted from below. "Fresh ones coming from the direction of the fort. Spread out," Briggs commanded with professional efficiency. "Check every cave, every hiding spot, every crevice big enough to hide a rabbit." She didn't just vanish into thin air. Sarah and Standing Bear climbed higher, their breath coming in sharp gasps that echoed softly off the stone walls. Standing Bear's strength was failing fast. She could feel him growing heavier against her shoulder, with each step his body gradually giving in to blood loss and trauma. Almost there, she whispered, though she had no idea if that was true or just desperate hope. They reached a narrow ledge where the passage opened into a small chamber about the size of a modest room. Standing, Bear collapsed against the stone wall, his face pale as winter snow, his breathing shallow and labored. "Cannot go farther," he gasped, his voice barely audible. Sarah looked around desperately, seeking some miracle or hidden advantage. The chamber connected to several other passages, a network of natural tunnels that honeycombed the canyon walls like some vast ant colony. But without Standing Bear's intimate knowledge of these routes, she could easily become lost in the maze for days. Now, which way to Hidden Valley? Standing Bear pointed toward the darkest passage with a trembling hand that required tremendous effort to lift. Follow the wind. Always follow wind that smells of sage and pine. 2 hours, maybe 3 if passage is difficult. You're coming with me. No. His voice was firm despite its weakness, carrying the authority of a warrior who'd accepted his fate. You go. Warn my people. Stop the massacre. I won't leave you here to die alone. Standing Bear caught her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the blood on his fingers and the pain racking his body. Sarah of the Bright Spirit, he said in Cheyenne, using the sacred name he'd given her during their childhood friendship. Some loves are stronger than death. Some promises last beyond this world. Before she could protest, he pressed something into her palm, a small piece of carved bone worn smooth by generations of handling and sacred use. My grandmother's spirit token. He explained, his voice growing fainter with each word. She said it would guide me to my true path in life. Now, it guides you to yours. Voices echoed from the passages below Briggs, and his men had found the hidden entrance and were beginning their methodical ascent, following tracks and bloodstains like hunting hounds on a scent trail. "Let go," Standing Bear urged with the last of his strength. "Every moment you delay, more innocents die needlessly." Sarah looked into his eyes one last time, memorizing every detail of his beloved face, the strong jaw, the gentle eyes, the mouth that had spoken words of love in 2 languages. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking with grief. "And I love you," he replied, his smile brilliant as summer lightning despite his pain. "In this life and all that follow. Now go and let our love save lives instead of ending them." Sarah kissed him fiercely, tasting blood and tears and the wild freedom of the frontier that had shaped them both. Then she turned and ran into the darkness of the tunnel, following the passage that led toward Hidden Valley and the desperate hope of preventing genocide. Behind her, she heard the sharp crack of gunfire as Standing Bear made his final stand, one wounded warrior against a dozen armed soldiers, buying her precious time with the last currency he possessed, his life. She ran through the darkness, guided by the spirit token in her hand, and the memory of Standing Bear's final gift of love. The passage twisted and turned through the mountain's heart, sometimes widening into natural chambers, where ancient waters had carved cathedral spaces, sometimes narrowing until she had to crawl on hands and knees through spaces barely large enough for her body. But always, when she paused to listen, she could smell sage on the wind, on the sacred plant that grew around the Cheyenne winter camp, carried on air currents that flowed through the mountain's hidden arteries like the breath of sleeping gods. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, Sarah emerged from a cave mouth high on a mountainside, blinking in afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the tunnel's darkness. Below her, Hidden Valley spread like a green jewel between towering peaks, a secret place where her mother's people had come for countless generations to wait out winter's harsh embrace. She could see the Cheyenne winter camp beside a crystalline lake that reflected the sky like a mirror of heaven. Dozens of teepees were arranged in traditional circles that honored the sacred directions, smoke rising from cooking fires, Children playing in the afternoon sun while their mothers worked at daily tasks, and their fathers tended horses or crafted tools and weapons. And approaching from the south, visible as a dust cloud against the valley's green perfection, a column of cavalry that could only be Harrison's strike force riding toward massacre with military precision and righteous certainty. Sarah half ran, half fell down the mountainside, her riding dress tearing on thorns and sharp rocks as she fought gravity and time in equal measure. Loose stones skittered beneath her feet, threatening to send her tumbling into space. But she pressed on with desperate determination. She had minutes, perhaps less, before Harrison's forces reached the valley floor and began their grim work. Danger. She screamed in Cheyenne as she burst from the tree line that bordered the camp. Soldiers coming. Many soldiers, danger to all. The camp erupted into organized chaos as her warning spread like wildfire through the community. Warriors grabbed weapons and mounted their fastest horses. Women gathered children and began moving toward pre-planned escape routes. Elders consulted rapidly about defensive positions and evacuation procedures. Chief White Eagle appeared from his lodge with the dignity of a man who'd faced crisis before and would face it again with courage. At 73, he moved slowly, but with purpose. His weathered face grim, but unsurprised by this development. "Sarah McKenna," he said in careful English, his voice carrying across the noise of preparation. "My son said you might come with warning. Your son is dead." Sarah gasped, the words tearing at her heart like physical wounds. "He died buying me time to warn you. Standing Bear died as a warrior protecting his people." Pain flickered across the old chief's face like shadow from a passing cloud. But his voice remained steady with the iron control of a leader who couldn't afford emotional collapse. "Then, his death will have meaning if we use his gift wisely." How many soldiers approach? 2 companies. More than 100 men well armed and mounted for rapid attack. White Eagle nodded grimly, his tactical mind already working through possibilities. Cannot fight so many in open ground with women and children present. Must scatter, use the mountains as our ancestors did when faced with overwhelming force. "There's something else you must know," Sarah said desperately. "General Harrison has been selling weapons to hostile tribes, creating conflicts to justify military action and federal spending. This massacre is designed to eliminate witnesses to his crimes." White Eagle's eyes sharpened with understanding that cut through cultural barriers. "And your father, Colonel McKenna?" Sarah nodded miserably, shame burning in her chest like acid. "He's been Harrison's partner in the arms dealing. They've been profiting from Indian wars for years, while pretending to serve peace and justice." The old chief studied her face with eyes that had seen too much betrayal to be shocked by more, but he seemed to find something there that satisfied him. "Yet you came to warn us knowing it would expose your own family's crimes and destroy your position in white society. Standing Bear taught me that some things are more important than blood ties." Sarah replied, thinking of her beloved's final words. "Honor, truth, love that transcends the hatred between our peoples." White Eagle placed a gnarled hand on her shoulder with grandfatherly warmth, despite the circumstances. "You have Cheyenne heart, Sarah McKenna. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that cryptic reference, a scout came running from the southern perimeter of the valley, his face tight with urgency and fear. "Soldiers in the valley," he reported breathlessly. "They will be here very soon, maybe 10 minutes, no more." White Eagle raised his voice in a command that sent the entire camp into coordinated motion with the efficiency of long practice. Warriors mounted their fastest horses and rode out to delay the approaching cavalry for as long as possible. Women and children melted into the forest like smoke following escape routes that had been planned for exactly this kind of emergency. "Come," White Eagle said to Sarah, gesturing toward a group of elders and wounded warriors who are preparing to evacuate by a different route. You ride with those who cannot fight. We have places in the high mountains where soldiers cannot follow. But Sarah shook her head with fierce determination. I'm not running anymore. I'm going to face Harrison directly and end this cycle of violence. That is certain death. White Eagle said, simply stating a fact rather than offering judgment. Maybe. But it's also the only way to stop the killing permanently. Sarah checked Morrison's pistol, making sure it was properly loaded and ready for use. Harrison thinks he can murder his way to prosperity and power. It's time to prove him wrong. White Eagle studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her bearing that reminded him of warriors preparing for their final battle. Then he nodded slowly, with the respect due to someone making the ultimate sacrifice. You are truly your mother's daughter. Morning Light also chose courage over safety when the choice mattered most. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow, staggering her backward. You knew my mother. She was my sister's child. White Eagle said quietly, his voice heavy with old grief and carefully preserved love. My blood niece, daughter of my heart. Which makes you family Sarah McKenna, no matter what anyone else might say about mixed blood or divided loyalties. Before Sarah could process this earth-shaking revelation fully, the cavalry burst into the valley with sabers flashing and rifles ready for immediate action. General Harrison rode at their head like a conqueror, claiming his prize, his uniform immaculate despite the hard ride, his face cold as winter stone. Sarah stepped into the open ground between the fleeing Cheyenne and the approaching soldiers, her hands raised, but her spine straight as an arrow. General Harrison, I'm here, let the others go. Harrison raised his hand with theatrical authority, halting the charge just short of the camp's perimeter. His cold eyes fixed on Sarah with satisfaction, the look of a chess player claiming his opponent's queen after a long and complex game. Miss McKenna. He called out, his voice carrying clearly across the valley with practiced military projection. How good of you to join us. I was beginning to worry you'd missed your own rescue from savage captivity. Rescue? Sarah laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the valley walls. Is that what you're calling mass murder now? Harrison dismounted with smooth grace and walked toward her, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip in a gesture that appeared relaxed but carried deadly intent. I'm calling it restoring order to a lawless territory, my dear. These savages have been smuggling weapons, planning coordinated attacks on innocent settlers throughout the region. The only weapon smuggling has been done by you and my father. Sarah shot back, raising her voice so every soldier in the column could hear her words clearly. The Cheyenne are innocent victims of your greed and ambition. Careful, my dear. Harrison said softly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout. Accusations like that could be considered treason against the territorial government, especially coming from someone with your questionable heritage. The words hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre, loaded with threat and implication. Around them, soldiers shifted nervously in their saddles, unsure what they were witnessing, but beginning to sense that this wasn't the straightforward military operation they'd been told to expect. Tell them the truth, General. Sarah set her voice, carrying to every man in the strike force. Tell them about the weapons you've been selling to hostile tribes to create conflicts. Tell them about the profits you've made from Indian wars while pretending to serve justice. Harrison's smile never wavered, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her words were having an effect on the listening soldiers. The ravings of a hysterical woman who's been corrupted by prolonged exposure to savage influence. Tragic, really, how quickly civilized behavior can deteriorate in the wilderness. Then explain the weapons cache in Devil's Canyon. Sarah pressed, stepping closer, despite the danger. Explain how you knew exactly where to find it. Explain why you had to torture Standing Bear to death to keep him from exposing your crimes. A murmur ran through the assembled cavalrymen, exchanging glances, questioning looks, the kind of doubt that could spread through military units like wildfire when leadership credibility came under attack. Some of these soldiers were beginning to look at their commanding officer with new eyes, seeing past the polished exterior to the corruption beneath. "Enough," Harrison said sharply, his voice cracking like a whip. "Miss McKenna, you're clearly suffering from some sort of mental breakdown brought on by your traumatic experiences. Report to the medical officer immediately for evaluation and treatment." "I'm suffering from the truth," Sarah replied, her voice ringing with conviction. "Something you've never been able to tolerate because it threatens your power and profit." Harrison's hand moved toward his pistol, but before he could draw the weapon, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Stand down, General." Colonel McKenna rode into the valley at the head of a second column of cavalry, his weathered face grim as Judgment Day itself. Behind him rode Lieutenant Morrison and a full company of soldiers' men whose loyalty belonged to the colonel rather than the general troops who'd served under McKenna for years and trusted his leadership. Harrison's face went pale as old bones as he realized the scope of the trap closing around him. "James, what the hell do you think you're doing here? Cleaning up a mess that should never have been made." McKenna replied, dismounting beside his daughter with movements that spoke of barely controlled rage. "Sarah, are you hurt?" "Standing Bear is dead." She said simply, the words carrying all the grief and loss she felt. Murdered by Harrison's men in Devil's Canyon while trying to protect his people. McKenna closed his eyes, as if absorbing a physical blow, his shoulders sagging under the weight of guilt and responsibility. When he opened them again, they were filled with the kind of pain that comes from looking into the mirror and seeing a monster. "I know," he said quietly, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "I found his body along with the others. I also found evidence of what really happened there." Harrison laughed, but the sound was strained and hollow. "James, surely you're not going to believe the fantasies of a half-breed girl over the word of your commanding officer and business partner." "I'm going to believe the evidence," McKenna said, producing a leather satchel from his saddlebag with deliberate ceremony. "Weapons manifests with your signature. Bills of sale to known hostile tribes. Financial records showing profits from arms deals. Correspondence with railroad companies about land acquisition following Indian removal." "Where did you get those documents?" "From your private safe," McKenna replied with grim satisfaction. Amazing what a man can find when he knows where to look and has the proper motivation for finding truth. Harrison's composure finally cracked completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath the polished military exterior. "You don't understand the larger picture, James. The railroad companies, the territorial government, Washington itself, they all need the Indian problem solved permanently. We've been providing a necessary service to American progress. We've been committing genocide for profit." McKenna corrected his voice, carrying the authority of absolute moral certainty. "And it ends here today permanently." But as McKenna spoke these words of justice and redemption, Sarah noticed movement in the rocks above the valley, the glint of rifle barrels, the shadow of men in positions commanding the entire area. Harrison had planned for this contingency, prepared for the possibility of betrayal or investigation. "Actually, James," Harrison said, his confidence returning as he realized his final trap was in place. "I'm afraid it's you who doesn't understand the true scope of this operation." He raised his hand in a predetermined signal, and gunfire erupted from the surrounding heights like thunder from a clear sky. McKenna's soldiers dove for cover as bullets whined off rocks and splashed in the pristine lake, turning paradise into a battlefield in seconds. "You see," Harrison continued conversationally, even as chaos erupted around them, "I've been planning this operation for months, accounting for every variable and contingency. Every possible betrayal, every potential witness, every threat to operational security. Sarah realized with growing horror that they'd walked into a carefully prepared killing ground. Harrison hadn't just planned to massacre the Cheyenne, he'd planned to eliminate any witnesses to his crimes, including her father and his loyal soldiers. The official report will state that Colonel McKenna and his daughter were tragically killed while attempting to prevent a coordinated Cheyenne attack on innocent territorial settlements. Harrison explained with the satisfaction of a chess master achieving checkmate. Very heroic, very convenient for all concerned parties. Sarah dove behind a boulder as a rifle cracked from the heights, the bullet chipping stone inches from her head and showering her with razor-sharp fragments. Around the valley, a fierce three-way firefight had erupted. Harrison's hidden riflemen firing down at McKenna's cavalry, who were caught in the open and scrambling for whatever cover they could find. But the trap had one critical flaw that Harrison hadn't anticipated in his meticulous planning. The Cheyenne warriors hadn't fled as expected. Instead of evacuating with the women and children, they'd taken concealed positions in the forest surrounding the valley. As Harrison's men revealed themselves on the heights, war cries echoed from the tree line as painted warriors emerged with rifles and traditional weapons, attacking the ambushers from behind. The battle became a chaotic three-way conflict. Harrison's forces caught between McKenna's disciplined cavalry and the Cheyenne warriors they'd come to massacre, fighting for their lives on multiple fronts, while their carefully laid plan collapsed into deadly confusion. Sarah crawled toward her father, who'd taken cover behind a fallen log with several of his men. "Pa, we need to get to higher ground." "Too dangerous," McKenna shouted over the gunfire, grabbing her arm. "Stay down and keep your head covered." But Sarah had spotted something that made her blood run cold with a terror beyond mere bullets and death. Tucked among the rocks near the lake's outlet, partially concealed but unmistakably lethal, was a large bundle of dynamite with multiple fuses leading to it, like the legs of some explosive spider. Harrison hadn't just planned to win this battle. He'd planned to destroy the entire valley, eliminating all evidence of his crimes and every witness who might testify against him. "He's going to blow the dam," she shouted, pointing toward the deadly bundle. "The whole valley will flood. Everyone will die." McKenna followed her gaze and saw the immediate danger, his tactical mind instantly grasping the implications. "Christ almighty. How long do we have?" Sarah could see slow-burning fuses snaking toward the explosives, their red sparks creeping closer to detonation with each passing second. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. Around them, the battle raged with increasing fury and desperation. Harrison's men had superior positions, but were outnumbered and facing attacks from multiple directions. The Cheyenne warriors fought with the desperate courage of people defending their families and sacred land. McKenna's soldiers provided disciplined firepower, but were caught in the crossfire between competing forces. "We have to reach those explosives and disconnect the fuses," McKenna said, checking his rifle's load. "I'll go," Sarah replied, already moving toward the lake. "I'm smaller, faster, less likely to draw concentrated fire." Absolutely not. But Sarah was already moving, crawling through the chaos toward the water's edge, while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. She used boulders and fallen logs for cover, her heart hammering against her ribs as she fought time and enemy fire in equal measure. The fuses had burned more than halfway to the main charge. Sarah reached the rocky outcrop where the explosives were hidden, her hands shaking as she examined the complex setup. Multiple bundles were connected by an intricate web of fuses and detonating charges designed to bring down a significant portion of the mountainside and flood the valley with deadly debris. The fuses had burned more than halfway to the main charges. Sarah. She turned to see Harrison approaching through the smoke and gunfire, his pistol trained on her chest with deadly intent. His uniform was torn and bloodied now, his face twisted with rage and desperation as his carefully laid plans crumbled around him. "Step away from there," he commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "This valley dies today, along with everyone in it who might threaten my operations." "Why?" Sarah asked, still working frantically at the burning fuses with her bare hands. Why destroy everything? Why kill so many innocent people? Because dead men tell no tales, Harrison replied with cold pragmatism. The arms dealing the manufactured conflicts, the profits from human misery, all of it dies here today. I'll emerge as the sole survivor of a tragic massacre, and my version of events becomes official history. Sarah managed to disconnect one fuse, but there were still 4 others burning steadily toward the main charges. Her fingers were bleeding from clawing at the rough cords, but she couldn't stop now. "What about your own soldiers?" she demanded. "What about the men who've served you faithfully? Acceptable casualties for the greater good," Harrison said without a trace of remorse. "Progress requires sacrifice, and some sacrifices are more necessary than others." Sarah looked into Harrison's pale eyes and saw something that chilled her more than the mountain wind, and the absolute conviction of a man who'd convinced himself that any atrocity was justified if it served his purposes. This wasn't mere greed or ambition. It was madness, dressed up as patriotic duty. "You're insane," she whispered finally, understanding the true scope of the evil she was facing. "I'm practical." Harrison corrected his finger tightening on the trigger. "Goodbye, Miss McKenna. Give my regards to your savage lover in whatever hell awaits half-breeds and their protectors." The gunshot cracked like thunder across the valley, but it wasn't Harrison's weapon that fired. Chief White Eagle stood 30 yards away, an ancient Henry rifle smoking in his weathered hands. Harrison staggered backward, looking down in shock and disbelief at the spreading red stain on his chest. "You," he gasped, then toppled forward into the lake with a splash that seemed to echo forever. Sarah had no time to process Harrison's death. The remaining fuses were almost at the explosives. She attacked them with desperate fury, her fingernails tearing as she clawed at the burning cords that meant death for everyone in the valley. 3 down, 2 to go. The penultimate fuse reached its charge just as Sarah's fingers found it. She jerked the cord away from the dynamite with seconds to spare the burning end hissing as it hit the water. 1 fuse left, and it was almost at the main charge. Sarah lunged for the final cord, her hands slipping on blood and water. Her fingertips brushed the burning fuse just as it reached the detonator. The explosion that followed wasn't the catastrophic detonation Harrison had planned, but a smaller blast that sent Sarah flying backward into the shallow water of the lake. Her ears rang like church bells, and blood ran from a dozen cuts on her face and hands. But she was alive. More importantly, the valley was safe. The silence that followed the explosion was deafening after the chaos of battle. Around Hidden Valley, the gunfire had stopped as both sides realized their immediate danger had passed. Harrison's surviving men, leaderless and demoralized, threw down their weapons in surrender. Sarah sat in the shallows of the lake, her hands trembling with exhaustion and shock, as the reality of survival slowly penetrated her battered consciousness. Chief White Eagle approached slowly, his ancient rifle still in his hands, but pointed at the ground. "It is finished," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Standing Bear?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer and dreaded its confirmation. White Eagle's weathered face was heavy with grief that transcended cultural boundaries. "My son walks with the ancestors now, but his sacrifice saved many lives, and his love saved you when it mattered most." Sarah nodded, tears she couldn't control running down her cheeks to mix with lake water and blood. Standing Bear was gone, but his final gift had made this victory possible. "What happens now?" she asked. Before White Eagle could answer, Colonel McKenna appeared at her side, his uniform torn and bloody, but his eyes clear for the first time in years. The moral weight that had been crushing him was finally lifted, replaced by the clean pain of honest grief. "Now we tell the truth," he said firmly, helping his daughter to her feet. "All of it. The arms dealing the manufactured conflicts, Harrison's conspiracy, everything comes out in official testimony. Even about me." Sarah asked quietly. About what I am. McKenna knelt beside his daughter, his weathered hand gentle on her shoulder, as he looked into eyes that carried her mother's strength and wisdom. Especially about you. You're the daughter of Morning Light, the bravest woman I ever knew. And you're Sarah McKenna, the woman who stopped a genocide. That's who you are, and I'm proud to call you my daughter. 6 months later, Sarah McKenna stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. Her testimony delivered in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the packed hearing room. She wore a simple black dress, her only ornamentation a small medicine pouch that held a piece of carved bone, Standing Bear's grandmother's spirit token. The weapons smuggling operation. She testified, looking directly at the committee members, was a deliberate conspiracy between General William Harrison and Colonel James McKenna to create artificial conflicts between white settlers and Native American tribes. They profited from these manufactured wars, while innocent people on both sides died for their greed. The aftermath of her testimony was swift and far-reaching, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. The territorial government was completely reorganized, corrupt officials removed from power, and new policies established to protect Native American rights and prevent future exploitation. Colonel McKenna was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged from the Army, though his cooperation with the congressional investigation spared him prison time. He retired to a small farm in Ohio, where he spent his remaining years writing letters to newspapers exposing corruption in frontier politics. Most importantly for Sarah, the Cheyenne were granted permanent protected status for their ancestral lands in Wyoming, their rights guaranteed by federal treaty and enforced by a new generation of honest territorial officials. But for Sarah, the victory felt hollow without Standing Bear beside her to share in the justice they'd fought to achieve. 1 year after the battle at Hidden Valley, Sarah McKenna returned to the place where her world had changed forever. She wore traditional Cheyenne dress, now soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork and porcupine quills. Her hair braided with sweetgrass and ribbons in the style of her mother's people. The valley looked exactly as it had before. Harrison's attacked the lake, reflecting mountain peaks, like a mirror of heaven, wildflowers blooming in meadows, where children played safely under their parents' watchful eyes. Chief White Eagle waited for her beside the crystalline lake, moving slowly but with dignity, despite his advanced age. In his hands, he carried a bundle wrapped in sacred cloth that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Today marks the anniversary of my son's death, he said in careful English, his voice carrying the weight of carefully preserved grief. It is time for you to have this. Sarah unwrapped the bundle with reverent fingers to find Standing Bear's war lance, its shaft decorated with eagle feathers and coup marks earned in honorable battle. At its base was carved the symbol of a bear standing on its hind legs, the sign that had given him his name and his identity as a warrior. I can't accept this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. It should go to a warrior of the tribe. It goes to the one who carried his heart. White Eagle replied with the authority of absolute certainty. You fought the greatest battle of all truth against lies, love, against hatred, courage, against corruption. That makes you a warrior in the truest sense of the word. Sarah cradled the lance against her chest, feeling the smooth wood worn by Standing Bear's hands during countless ceremonies and battles. Do you think he's at peace? White Eagle smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with joy that transcended earthly sorrow. Look around you, Sarah McKenna. His people live free and safe. The truth about Harrison's crimes has ended the arms dealing forever. Children play without fear in their parents' lodges. If that is not peace, what greater peace could any warrior's soul desire? As if summoned by his words, a group of Cheyenne children came running from the village, their faces bright with the joy of innocence preserved. Among them was a little girl with dark hair and gentle eyes, the daughter of Standing Bear's cousin, born just 3 months after the battle. The child's name was Morning Light, chosen to honor both Sarah's mother and the promise of new beginnings that comes with each generation. As Sarah lifted the baby into her arms, she felt the circle of life complete itself, past and future, joining in this moment of perfect love. "Tell us about the bear spirit," one of the older children demanded, settling in the grass around Sarah's feet, with the expectant faces of young people hungry for stories. Sarah smiled and began the tale she'd told 100 times, but would never tire of telling how Standing Bear had earned his name by facing down a grizzly bear to protect his younger sister, how he'd grown into a warrior who fought with wisdom rather than anger, how he'd loved a white woman deeply enough to die for her people's freedom. As she spoke, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to bless the valley with divine approval. The children listened with wide eyes, absorbing the legend that would be passed down through generations like sacred medicine. When the story ended, the children scattered back to their families, leaving Sarah alone beside the lake, with Standing Bear's war lance and the memories of a love that had transcended death itself. She touched the carved bear symbol with reverent fingers, remembering his promise by the sacred waters where their story had begun and ended. "I will never let you go," she whispered to the evening wind. And in the dance of starlight on water, in the eternal song of wind through mountain passes, in the laughter of children playing safely in the firelight, Sarah felt Standing Bear's presence as real as her own heartbeat. But as she stood to return to the village where she now lived as a bridge between two worlds, she noticed something that made her breath catch in wonder. There, carved into the bark of a cottonwood tree beside the lake, were fresh symbols, a bear and a woman hands, joined, surrounded by the spiral that meant eternal love in Cheyenne tradition. She approached the tree with trembling fingers, touching the carved symbols that seemed to pulse with warmth despite the cooling evening air. The work was recent, the sap still fresh, but no one in the village claimed to have made it. "He was here," whispered a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find an ancient Cheyenne woman she'd never seen before, her face lined with years beyond counting, but her eyes bright with knowledge that seemed to span lifetimes. "Who was here?" Sarah asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "The one who loved you beyond death itself." The spirits sometimes return to sacred places, especially when the heart that calls to them burns bright enough to bridge the distance between worlds. Sarah looked back at the carving, her breath catching, as she realized its implications. Whether created by human hands or something more mysterious, it didn't matter. What mattered was the message it carried, that love transcended death. The promises made in life continued beyond the grave, that some bonds were too strong for even mortality to break. She pressed her palm against the carved symbols and felt warmth that had nothing to do with the dying sunlight, and the warmth of love that would never fade, of promises that would never be broken, of a warrior's spirit watching over the woman he'd chosen to protect. "I will never let you go either," she whispered to the tree, to the evening wind, to the spirit that lived on in this sacred place. The lake reflected the rising stars like diamonds scattered on dark velvet. And Sarah McKenna, daughter of two worlds, keeper of sacred promises, guardian of truth, finally understood that home wasn't a place you were born, but a love you chose to honor. She had chosen love over everything else the world offered, and love had chosen her in return. Standing Bear's war lance in her hands, his people's stories in her heart, Sarah walked back toward the village where children played safely in the firelight, where the future stretched bright with possibility, where love had conquered hatred and truth had triumphed over lies. In the years that followed, Sarah became a respected leader among the Cheyenne, serving as liaison between her adopted people and the reformed territorial government. She never married again, dedicating her life to ensuring that the peace Standing Bear had died for would endure for generations. She lived to be 93, dying peacefully in her sleep, beside the same lake where she'd first heard Standing Bear whisper that he would never let her go. Her last words, according to those who attended her passing, were spoken in Cheyenne. "I'm coming, my heart. I'm finally coming home." The Cheyenne buried her with full honors beside the cottonwood tree, where the mysterious carving had appeared her grave, marked with Standing Bear's war lance, and a simple inscription in both English and Cheyenne. She chose love over everything else, and love chose her in return. Some promises, after all, are worth dying for. Some loves are worth living forever, and in Hidden Valley, where the lake still reflects the eternal sky and children still play safely in the firelight, the wind carries whispers of a love story that transcended every barrier, race and culture, life, and death, time and eternity itself. The bear spirit and his bright-spirited woman dance together still in the place where all true loves are born, and reborn world without end.